Welcome and thanks for joining us on World Insight. I'm Mi Qiuyuan in Beijing. Coming up on today's program, Obama in Britain on a visit to one of the U.S. traditional allies. President Obama ruffles feathers with a plea against the potential Brexit. Has the U.S.-UK love affair cooled? Plus, a historic Earth Day. China joins as many as 170 nations today in signing the Paris Agreement on climate change, committing to reduce global warming pollutants. We begin today's show with U.S. President Barack Obama's visit to London. Now, this is Obama's fifth visit to the country during his time in office and likely to be the last one. In an interview before his visit, Obama made an impassioned appeal for Britain to remain in the European Union for the upcoming EU referendum. But some people see this as an unnecessary intervention. Well, will his visit change the result of the vote? Let's take a look.
Greeted by the Queen at Windsor Castle just a day after she celebrated her 90th birthday. And meeting with UK Prime Minister Cameron is another highlight on the agenda. The two have plenty to discuss, but a central issue is whether Britain should exit the EU. Obama has already weighed in on the argument, making it clear that he thinks the UK would be better off staying inside the EU.
Having the United Kingdom in the European Union gives us much greater confidence about the strength of the transatlantic union and is part of the cornerstone of institutions built after World War II that has made the world safer and more prosperous.
But those who are campaigning for a potential Brexit aren't happy about his comments. London Mayor Boris Johnson expressed his firm opposition, describing Obama's argument as inconsistent and downright hypocritical.
America guards its sovereignty with such hysterical jealousy that American diplomats in this city still refuse to pay the congestion charge and owe Londoners more than £9 million, which could be spent on transport improvements. And again, it is paradoxical, inconsistent, incoherent.
This deal brings back...
Obama's visit to the UK comes after a recent slump for the camp arguing for Britain to stay in the EU. The latest polls show that 43% of respondents want Britain to stay in the EU, a wafer-thin advantage over the 42% of people who want to leave. Over the last 8 years, a close bond has developed between Obama and Cameron, but it hasn't always been easy. The president has been blunt over Cameron's role in Libya, and harsh words were exchanged when it looked like Britain was about to cut its defense spending. Through times of war and rebellion, peace and estrangement, Britain and the U.S. have cemented deeply rooted links in what is known as a special relationship, in not only business cooperation but also shared culture. Although Obama's comments on Brexit have raised criticisms that the U.S. believes Britain is simply a part of the European project, the U.S. hopes his visit will put U.S.-UK ties back on track.
All right, for more on Obama's visit to the UK in the Beijing studio, we have Mr. Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Also in Beijing, we have John Ross, Senior Fellow at the Chaoyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. And in Washington, D.C., we have Ambassador Kurt Volker, former U.S. Ambassador and Permanent Representative to NATO. Welcome to you all. So looming over President Obama's visit to the UK is, of course, the Brexit referendum talk, which is coming soon in a couple of months on June 23rd. So let's start with that. Ambassador Volker, help us understand Americans' perspective on this. What's at play there on the American side?
Well, I think what President Obama is expressing is an American perception that the United States is better off if the UK is in the European Union. We have a substantial transatlantic relationship with the EU. Having the UK in pushes the European Union more in a market direction, more in a transatlantic direction, less regulation, more open economies, more global outlook. And so those sorts of attributes with the EU make the EU a better partner for the US. That's a very different argument, though, from saying it's in the UK's own interest to be in the European Union? That's something that I think really British voters have to decide. And I do think it's important for American commentators to be careful about expressing a view how Britons ought to vote.
So, Mr. Ross, how's President Obama's perspective being received there in Britain? I mean, how much influence does he have on this?
Well, as I'm a British citizen, I'm entitled to have a view on this, so I should make it clear, which is I'm against Brexit and will vote in favour of remaining within the European Union. I actually agree very much with Ambassador Volker. President Obama is expressing the United States' interests that Britain should remain part of the European Union. Britain would not be very useful to the United States outside the European Union, because the most important role for Britain for the United States is to influence Germany and France. The most powerful combination in Europe is France and Germany. That's the real core of the European Union. But nevertheless, Britain is a significant member, and although it cannot totally determine the views of Germany and France, nevertheless it has a weight in influencing them. So it is definitely in the interests of the United States for Britain to remain within the EU.
So President Obama has been criticized for, supporting the state campaign out of self-interest, but is it of the best interest for the UK? I mean, there's criticism calling President Obama, this is by the London Mayor, Boris Johnson, Mr. Sway, who is also, the de facto leader of the Leave campaign, who is possibly the successor of Prime Minister David Cameron. He's calling President Obama a hypocrite, saying that he's flying a double standard there, saying that no American politicians would let an outside authority like EU Commission to override U.S. Congress, U.S. laws, or border controls. Is it a double standard there?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's understandable that, especially from Mr. Johnson, because who is a very, very strong support to the leaving EU, I mean in UK. I think this reason for those people who, criticize Mr. Obama is they just take a very simple case, say that even, for example, to take a comparison between United States and the UK, once there is United States, a country which have to face a very, very big multilateral group like EU, how could the US do? For example, once there is some, a law from European Union will be go beyond this, domestic law or some other regulation in United States. Could the United States accept this kind of situation? Very, very simple case. But of course, I think that now the question is not only the Mr. Cameron and Mr. Obama and Mr. Johnson. All of them, they want to get right to redefine the interests of UK.
So whether a Brexit is good for the UK, I want to show this to our viewers and to all of you. The International Monetary Fund forecast that investor confidence and financial markets would be shaken in the event of the Brexit on Wednesday. 8 former US Treasury chiefs wrote in a letter to the Times of London and that Brexit could diminish Britain's influence and threaten London's global primacy as a financial center. Mr. Ross, what do you think?
Well, firstly, I think Brexit is not going to happen. I don't think there is the faintest chance that Britain will leave the European Union, because 3 very powerful forces are against it. The United States is against it, the City of London and most of British big business is against it, and the Labour Party is very firmly against it. Although the Tory party is divided, with probably a majority of Tory party members in favour of leaving, only I think a handful, less than 10 Labour MPs are in favour of the withdrawal from the European Union. And so the combination of that means it's really a hypothetical question. It would indeed damage Britain's, the City of London, but as it's not going to happen, it's not a very serious threat.
Do you agree with what's being said, Mr. Sway?
I think that so far, especially for those partners, other economies in the world, even most of international community, the worry is about what is Brexit if they're kind of a systematic risk for all the economy, international trade and investment, because as we know now, we are living in a globalized world. Once there are some more uncertainties happen, like Brexit, perhaps we have to face some very, very negative effect from this event.
All right, so clearly President Obama wants the UK to stay in the EU, and it's not the first time a US president has commented so directly on a foreign referendum. In 1995, then President Bill Clinton traveled to Ottawa to encourage voters in Quebec not to vote for sovereignty, and provincial voters sided with him. In the days before Scotland's 2014 referendum on independence, President Obama expressed the hope that the UK would remain strong, robust, and united. Scottish voters agree with him. So, Ambassador Volker, what do you think of such intervention? Do you think that U.S. should have a strong voice in other countries' domestic affair or a referendum like this?
I think it's just very important to be careful about how one does it. I think it is very fair for the United States President to express an American interest. What is in the U.S. interest? We are better off with the European Union and has the UK in it. That's perfectly fair. I think it risks crossing a line when you start urging the voters of another country how to vote, because that can very well create a backlash, that they don't like to have that kind of external pressure. So it's important to be very careful.
Okay, let's now talk about the special relationship, the U.S.-UK special relationship. Mr. Cui, I understand you wrote an opinion piece that U.S.-UK relationship is in the decline. How do you think that the relationship devolve over time? Because they remain a very close relationship in the Cold War.
Yeah, as we understand, there is a kind of a so-called special relations between the UK and the US, especially in the period of Cold War. So, of course, recent years we can also witness a kind of decline of this kind of special relations. I think we have to recognize that the situation, the background, and the whole situation in the world changed a lot. I think that's a very, very big reason why we are witnessing decline of these special relations. If we, of course, look at more at this kind of special relations, we can find out always from both sides stressed the value or some interests. But now I think the problem is, especially from maybe UK side, that it want to get some more from its external relations with other countries, not only with the United States. I think that would be a very, very big challenge to this kind of special relationship.
But on this relationship, Mr. Ross, is that the same sense you're feeling? You know, with Americans' strategic shift towards the Asia-Pacific, Europe is no longer the center of Americans' foreign policy. Do you feel that America is walking away from its traditional allies?
No, I don't. I have a rather longer-term perspective. There was a great debate in Britain at the end of the 19th century. Don't forget, at the end of the 19th century, the superpower in the world was Britain, not the United States. Yeah. And there was a very long debate, very explicit, over many decades, that Britain would either have to fight a war with the United States or accommodate the rise of the United States and accept a secondary role. It's a very interesting analogy, instead, for the United States and China, because the United States now faces the question of a rising new superpower, and what will it do? Britain took a very conscious decision that it was going to facilitate and help the rise of the United States quite openly. And the United States replaces the world superpower. And that decision was taken 100 years ago and has never changed. You should not confuse a few tactical differences, like on the AIIB, with a fundamental realignment. Fundamentally, Britain took a decision 100 years ago to become a secondary ally of the United States. It's never changed from it, and it's not going to change from it.
But isn't it interesting to watch what's at play there between UK, US, and China? I mean, UK is seeking a good economic relationship, good financial ties with Beijing. I mean, last time President Xi Jinping visited the UK, it was dubbed a golden decade of relationship between China and UK. What kind of message is that sending? UK is sending to America. Doesn't that play out as a less emphasis of American dominance on their relationship?
No, on certain narrow economic interests, Britain will always take an independent view from the United States. Margaret Thatcher, for example, was greatly urged by the United States to oppose the building of gas pipelines between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. And Mrs. Thatcher, and there was no firmer ally of the United States than Mrs. Thatcher, refused to take the American position on this, and she supported the gas pipelines. Yeah, but So therefore some conflict on secondary questions between allies will always take place, but neither Britain nor the United States confuses those types of secondary questions with the basic military and economic strategic alliance which exists between the two countries. So I do not really see any fundamental decline in the relationship, the special relationship as it's so called. More it's called special in Britain than in the United States, incidentally. But nevertheless, I don't see any great decline in this special relationship now.
Ambassador Walker, what do you think of this?
I largely tend to agree. I do think this plays out over a long period of time, as he indicates. I would say, however, that there has been some shift in British public attitudes, which is a bit more America skeptic, and emphasizing a degree not to be America's poodle, not being told what to do. This goes back really to the relationship between President Bush and Prime Minister Blair more than it does even the Obama era, although President Obama, I think, has continued to have that kind of more distant relationship with the British public. That being said, the fabric of the relationship is not just about politics and political leaders. It's about the economy, it's about culture, it's about the arts, it's about travel and tourism, it's about language, it's about literature, it's about music. And so there is just a rich, rich fabric of US-UK relationship that goes well beyond the politics. And that is unchanged and unlikely to change.
What about Obama's comments on Libya? Mr. Cui here. Earlier in March, President Obama said in an interview, The Atlantic, he's suggesting that Prime Minister David Cameron was distracted. He was kind of laying the blame of the collapse of Libya and the downfall of Muammar Gaddafi after that, primarily at Europe's door. He was expecting his ally to do more in stabilizing the situation. That caused quite a stir on the Downing Street.
Mm-hmm. So it's a very interesting issue because as we know now, it looks like President Obama kicked off his season of farewell because he will end his years in White House soon. But of course, I think now the question is, it's difficult for us to make a judgment, say that once there are some more cooperation between UK and the US in international or regional affairs, there will be a more peaceful or a better world. And also, of course, as we know that one of the very important part of this special relationship between US and UK is they did they did a lot of cooperation in the past to have some interference or intervention in some other domestic affairs, other countries. So I think that, of course, already President Obama recognized it's a failure, of its Libya policy. So I don't know if we could track to this logic to say that any kind of a cooperation between US and UK on this matter of interference or intervention in other countries like Libya, or maybe in future, or maybe probably they want to do something in Syria. So I think that it's not only a question for Mr. Obama, Mr. Cameron. I think it should be a question for all of the international community.
And you mentioned earlier that Washington is seeking other allies, other friends in that region. Is it the case that if it happens to, say, foreign policy over Ukraine or economic policies, Washington will seek to talk to Merkel, perhaps? If it's military staff, he would choose to talk to the French. Is that the case?
No, it's a little bit different because as we understand now, the background is United States, seems to me, is withdrawing its intervention or some interference in other part of the world, because as we understand, because Obama's administration realized or regards this economy recovery as its priority. So of course now, maybe, I don't know, because we will have a new president in White House soon. I don't know if this kind of logic will keep going on or not. But another question is, certainly there will be more and more, I think, a smart diplomacy for US and also for
limited
European.
time left. I want to bring Russia into the picture. Some has argued that by limiting its involvement in the Middle East and Europe, that the United States has left a power vacuum there, and Russia has filled that. Think about Russia's annexation of Crimea. Ambassador Volker, what do you think of that statement?
I think that's exactly right. I think in the last several years, the U.S. has pulled back from a lot of its engagements in the world. I think the criticism about Libya toward the UK, for instance, is very unfair. It was an operation that the US, UK, and France launched together, and then abruptly, within 2 weeks, the US pulled back from that. And without that sense that the US was with the operation, the degree to which allies were willing to then follow through after Gaddafi was toppled with the stabilization operation was just not there. No one wanted to have boots on the ground. So I don't think it's fair to criticize the UK for that. And when you look more broadly, as you said, at Syria, at Libya today, at Ukraine, the U.S. has not been willing to play that global security role that the U.S. had played in the past, and Russia has been very quick to step in and take advantage of that, and indeed has both initiated conflicts and persisted, and the U.S. response, together with Germany and others, has been to try to de-escalate rather than to respond to that situation.
All right. Thank you so much, Ambassador Volker and Mr. John Ross, also on your personal opinion on this referendum. Very interesting to hear. And also, Mr. Cui Hongjian, thank you so much for your analysis and insights. Now, stay with us here on World Insight. We've got our final segment coming up. On this historic Earth Day, China joins as many as 170 nations in signing the Paris Agreement on climate change. Or can it reverse the effects of global warming? That's next. Welcome back. The Paris Agreement, reached late last year, will be signed on a historic Earth Day at the biggest civic event in the world and a celebration of the planet. More than 165 UN members are expected to attend a high-level signing ceremony hosted at the United Nations headquarters in New York. Now, the signing ceremony will mark the first step toward ensuring that the landmark Paris Agreement enters into force as early as possible. Before that, before we go to our panel, let's take a look at the deal.
For the future of the Earth. 4 months after the announcement of the Paris Agreement, leaders of more than 165 countries are about to sign one of the most important agreements on significant carbon reductions.
Putting this in historical context, we've never had so large a number of countries signing an international agreement in one day.
The Paris Agreement signaled an end to the fossil fuel era, committing nearly 200 participants to a universal agreement to cut greenhouse gas emissions and to avoid the most dangerous effects of climate change. Key measures in the Paris deal include keeping global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius more than the level of pre-industrial times, and endeavor to limit them even more to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The deal also calls to peak greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, and to limit the amount of emissions to the same levels that trees, soil, and oceans can absorb naturally at the second half of the century. Under the agreement, each country's contribution to cutting emissions will be reviewed every 5 years as they scale up to the challenge. Rich countries will need to help poorer nations by providing climate finance to adapt to climate change and switch to renewable energy. China and the United States were two of the driving forces behind the approval of the agreement at last year's Paris Climate Summit.
China has played an important role in helping all meeting participants reach the agreement. Before the summit, China and the U.S. issued joint statements on climate change twice.
Chinese President Xi also reaffirmed China's pledge to cut its carbon emissions at the summit. And climate change and ecological efforts have been integrated into China's 13th five-year blueprint. The pessimistic mood after the failure of the Copenhagen Agreement in 2009 has shifted to the cheers and tears of the Paris Climate Summit. The deterioration of the global climate leaves no time to waste. Signing the Paris Agreement is just the first step to ensuring the future of our planet.
Now, for more discussion on this topic, we're joined by Ms. Wu Changhua, Chair of China Redesign Hub. In New York, we have Ranping Song from the Developing Countries Climate Action Manager of the World Resource Institute. And also in New York, we're joined by Barbara Finnemore, Senior Attorney and Asia Director at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Welcome to you all. Now, first of all, world leaders are hailing. Yes, Happy Earth Day. Now, this Earth Day, is seen as a symbolic day, a landmark day for the Paris Pact as a great success, but many still remember the pessimistic mood after the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Conference. So back then, a Guardian poll suggested even 9 out of 10 scientists wasn't so sure that political will see it through. What has changed? It seems like everybody's full of confidence now, Ms. Wu.
I think the world continues to evolve. I don't think dramatically changed anything, but I think it's been evolution. Particularly 3 things that have happened. One, I think the successful outcome of COP21 definitely is a big factor of the change. Secondly, I think the world more and more recognize actually the climate change is happening. It's impacting all our lives and economic activities, and we just have to do things actually around that. Another thing actually is really coming together and leadership of the major economies. In that context, in particular US, China joining hands, we have already 3 actually joint presidential level announcement on partnership on climate change issues there. I think all those factors coming together definitely has built up the foundation for the world to become more confident and more determined to address climate change challenges.
Right. Mr. Song, help us understand how difficult the road was to reach such a large-scale global agreement. I mean, now over 165 countries are committed to it. What was the major bone of contention before reaching this agreement?
Well, of course, you can see that so many different countries that were really different places, in terms of development, in terms of the emissions, in terms of their priorities. I think that's really actually a really challenging task that we actually come to accomplish. And actually, let me just correct that. We are not only have 165 or 68 countries. Actually, the latest news telling us that we have 171 countries coming together to sign is a first international agreement that have so many countries, record-breaking countries coming together to sign this agreement. So it actually showcase that countries are really committed. They understanding this good for their own economy, good for their environment, and most of all, it's good for the planet.
They are committed, but Ms. Finnemore, what are they committing to by signing this agreement?
Well, countries have each made their own.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. In signing the Paris Agreement, more than 190 countries eventually have agreed to cut their carbon emissions in a way that is acceptable and appropriate for their own level of development. They have agreed to increase those commitments every 5 years. They have agreed to take necessary domestic action in order to achieve those mitigation pledges, and they've committed to reporting on their progress and on their emissions. They've also agreed to increase the level of financial assistance to countries that are more vulnerable and least able to cope with the impacts of climate change.
So they set up different targets according to their different development status, but if countries interpret those targets differently, would that hamper the enforcement process, Ms. Finnemore?
Well, countries are there is a new enhanced transparency mechanism by which each country reports on their progress and on their emissions, and there is a panel of experts that will review that, and countries will also determine, their fellow countries, how well they are meeting that progress. And for countries that aren't meeting their emissions, that have fallen off the track, there is a new mechanism, a committee of experts that is designed to help those countries get back on track. And even though this enhanced transparency mechanism applies to every country, there is built-in flexibility to accommodate varying levels of national capacity. But the idea is that over time, every country will reach the same level of accountability for meeting those climate pledges and for increasing them every 5 years to a level that reflects their highest level of ambition.
All right. Now, it is to me that, as London said, it's critical to be this COP21 deal to be universally and legally binding. So is that so, Ms. Wu?
I I think so. This is we're talking about the international legal framework, right? With a major convention, probably one of the largest scale of conventions, with so many countries signing up to that and addressing a global challenge like climate change issues there. So yes, Paris Agreement is just to a large extent different from a lot of international legal framework. For a long time, we're used to actually top-down and legally binding, top-down driven, but somehow there has been a lot of creation or innovation in the Paris Agreement that we are giving more opportunities to be bottom up. So countries need to be willingly actually putting the commitments on the table so that they are held accountable, but in the meantime actually aligned with their capability and the level of development, and also, as Barbara mentioned as well, creating the mechanism periodically. We're going to revisit those pledges. Hopefully through that process we'll be able to lift up continuously in order to really meet the goal we set, temperature increase no more than 2 degrees by the end of the century, and aiming for 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think this is the track we already created actually, and now we need to move forward.
So Mr. Song, what do you think of this? Do you think this agreement is forceful enough to hold countries accountable for their emission cuts targets?
Well, I think it's a very good first step. I think it set up the great platform. I think I think as others has already explained, that it's a first step. What countries committed is not enough to get where we want to go. It's not good enough to avoid dangerous climate, but actually it's already a really good platform, really good systems, the review mechanisms, the transparencies, and all this mutual momentum. We see a lot of actions since Paris actually already. Countries are acting, China, US, India, they're putting out really ambitious, renewable energy plans, and they're actually making already aggressive investments. I think that is what we need to see. We cannot expect everything go to that place in the first go, but I think we're getting really good platforms and we're making very good foundations.
So we are building a good foundation is a good start, but Ms. Finnemore, I understand you probably have more to say on the legal side. I understand that after today's deal, there will be domestic ratifying process for many countries. Some analysts say that it will take at least 2 years. So are we a little more over-optimistic at this stage now?
Well, the way the agreement is written, once 55 countries that represent 55% of global CO2 emissions formally sign and join the agreement, it will go into force. Now, the fact that people have mentioned already that nearly over 170 of the 190 countries have already agreed that will be signing the agreement today is a sign of incredible momentum. But yes, as you say, every one of these countries will then have to go through their domestic process for formally joining the agreement. But the fact is that China and the US have both announced that they will formally join the agreement this year, and China just this morning said that they plan to join the agreement before the G20 meeting in September. So once again, this will provide incredible momentum, since both China and the US together are responsible for 40% of global CO2 emissions. And there's signs that other countries are already also planning to join the agreement formally before the end of this year. So we think this significantly increases the likelihood that the agreement will formally enter into force this year.
And on that matter, let me read this to our viewers and to all of you. Now, China and the United States are believed to have led a push to bring the pact to signing faster than expected. Now, this is partly because the two countries account for nearly 40% of world greenhouse gas emissions. In the ranking of nations' emissions, China topped the world with more than 20%, and the United States has around 18%, and followed by Russia and India. As the world's largest emission contributor, how will China's emission cut perfect China's policy making? What price will China pay for a cooler Earth, Ms. Wu?
I think the international process definitely has a very important sort of push for the domestic efforts. If you look at the Chinese effort, we've been committed to increasing energy efficiency, develop alternative energies, in the meantime actually to reduce emissions for air pollution purposes, but also actually for the carbon emission reduction there as well. And without the international process like this, probably there will be much less pressure on the speed and the effort probably domestically. So now the two are so perfectly aligned with each other, so that we'll be able to take on the responsibility addressing global climate change issues from China's side, but also domestically we'll be able to speed up the process to address air pollution issues there as well. So China definitely is very serious about it, and we are already building the international commitments into domestic process. For instance, the 13th five-year plan, which was released last month, actually already started to demonstrate elements like that already.
And like you said, let's just play this to our viewers. Scientists from the London School of Economy issued a study suggesting that China is actually doing better than expected, and China may see its emission reaching a cap by 2025. In the next 10 years, the country's energy intensity would drop 4% due to an economic transition from carbon-intensive heavy industry to services, and China's energy consumption growth will slow to only 1.8% between 2016 to 2025, compared with an annual rate of 8% between 2000 and 2013. Meantime, the Chinese government's vision on deriving 15% of primary energy from non-fossil sources by 2020 is likely to be fulfilled earlier. That's according to experts. So that report seems to be quite optimistic about China's efforts. Do you agree, Mr. So?
Yes, I think that is totally feasible. I think it's totally possible. We've been there. We are going there. I think a lot of signs actually telling us, the coal consumption going down, the renewable energy construction is going up, and investment after all is all the way through in the last 5 years. I think we have a lot of potential to go there, but by no means this is going to be easy. This is not a done deal. There's a lot of hard efforts going to shift the people's habit, shift the the investment from the fossil fuel to renewable energies, and we need to ensure a just transition for the people who work in the fossil fuel industries, in the coal mine, in the steel, that we need to find a way to find a new job for them, or to find a way to integrate them in a new green economy. So this by no means an easy thing, by no means is done deal. But yes, we're on the way there. It's totally possible and feasible.
Right, it won't be an easy task, Ms. Vennamore. Now, do you think that China can strike a balance between going green and sustain its economic growth and its employment rate?
I do believe that by going green, China can actually spur its economy and move away from its old economic model, which was based on heavy industry and is simply no longer sustainable. So China has already moved to a new paradigm of economic growth that is slower but higher quality growth. Now, this is not accidental. They are taking decisive actions to close down coal mines, to reduce overcapacity in heavy industry, and so forth. But they are going to have a wrenching transition from old jobs to jobs in the new jobs of the future. Our report by a team of Chinese experts has found that putting a cap on coal consumption will actually create more jobs in clean energy that would be lost in the old coal industry. However, there's going to be retraining required, and the 13th five-year plan has included $23 billion to help workers in these older industries acquire the skills that they need to move to the jobs of the future in industries such as biotechnology, aviation, and information management.
And China is also accelerating its urbanization process. What do you think that's going to do to the country's efforts in going green?
Different ways of looking at it. On one side, this potentially could create this sort of additional emissions. But in the meantime, actually, if you look at the technology development progress that has been happening in the last decade and today, and even looking to the tomorrow, you started to feel confident that there are smart solutions that we will be able to, carry on the urbanization process, not necessarily creating, too much or additional emissions. And so decoupling is already a major effort or achievement, actually, showing in the Chinese economy. So on one side, we continue to grow the economy. On the other side, we do not necessarily need to increase as much energy consumption and with actually the emissions there. So I think the trend is already obvious, and we need to adopt more aggressive clean technologies in the urbanization process, really started to look at creating the infrastructure in the urbanization process that will be able to really address not only the environmental issues but also the energy issues.
The clean energy, isn't that a major challenge? I mean, no country has so far has detailed a credible strategy to achieve what scientists think is necessary, ending the era of fossil fuel emissions and then converting entirely to clean energy.
I disagree. I think Germany is already on the track. If you look at achievements delivered in Germany today, it's already more than 30% of its energy already from renewable energy. And in the next maybe 10, 15 years, getting to the 50, by mid of the century, probably 100% of renewable energy there already. And you also started to see more and more companies coming on board to commit to 100% of renewable energy there. So I disagree with that sort of statement. I think you need to look at what is really happening on the track already. And then if you look at China, China is already making huge progress towards renewable energy efficiency and renewable energy there. We're not there yet, but somehow we are definitely stepping up the efforts, making all the commitments we could in order to speed up the process.
All right, thank you all. Ms. Wu Changhua joining me in the Beijing studio, and Mr. Song Renping joining us from New York, and also Ms. Barbara Finnemore, also in New York. Appreciate your insights.
It's great.
And that's all we have for today's World Insight. If you'd like to see more, you can visit our website. Just type World Insight CCTV News into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. From me, Li Qiuyan, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights from across China and around the world.